Lieutenant Colonel Blair Paddy Mayne wasn't just a soldier. He was a brawler, a killer, a legend. Feared not for how many men he killed, but for how he did it. Edward Henry Blair Mayne was born on January 11, 1915, in Newtownards, a town in County Down, Northern Ireland. His family lived in comfort. His father, William Mayne, was a successful solicitor, known in legal circles for his discipline and sharp mind. His mother, Margaret Mayne, was quieter but firm, raising 6 children with strict values. Paddy, the youngest son, stood out early, not for his studies or manners, but for his physical strength and unpredictable behavior. He was not an ordinary child. He didn't shy away from confrontation, and he never followed quietly. He challenged everything, even authority. The family hoped he'd grow into a calm, respectable man like his father. But Paddy had different instincts. By the time he reached grammar school, his size was already intimidating. Teachers struggled to control him. He often ignored rules and pushed boundaries. He didn't care about fitting in. What caught everyone's attention was his obsession with the outdoors. He spent hours alone with rifles, stalking deer across Irish hills, or wrestling boys twice his weight just for the thrill. His older brothers tried to guide him, but even they couldn't match his aggression. Paddy wasn't just strong. He enjoyed using that strength. He wasn't a bully, but when provoked, he exploded with sudden violence. Teachers feared that if he didn't find discipline, his anger would spiral. He enrolled at Queen's University, Belfast, following in his father's footsteps to study law. But lecture halls meant little to him. What truly gripped him was sport, especially rugby and boxing. On the rugby field, he was a beast. His sheer force left opponents winded and bruised. In 1936, he earned a place on the British and Irish Lions tour to South Africa, a rare honor for someone so young. It was a brutal tour, rough play, hard tackles, and endless physical pressure. Paddy thrived. He wasn't just good, he was feared. Fans cheered him, but teammates kept their distance. His temper was volcanic. He clashed with authority, disagreed with management, and got into physical fights with his own squad. During a heated argument, he famously punched a fellow player unconscious. Coaches considered sending him home early. When the tour ended, Mayne returned to Belfast with a reputation as both a rising star and a problem. He continued boxing at a high level, known for his raw power and vicious uppercuts. In the ring, he fought without hesitation. Every punch had intention, but his future was uncertain. Law wasn't a passion, and sports couldn't contain his anger. Those who knew him sensed he was teetering between success and destruction. Then came 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and Britain entered World War II. The newspapers announced war. For many young men, it was terrifying. For Paddy Mayne, it was a moment of clarity. The world needed warriors, and finally he had a reason to unleash what had always burned inside him. He didn't hesitate and enlisted in the Royal Artillery, the traditional branch for educated men like him. But the structure, the routine, and the distant kind of warfare didn't suit him. He was restless, itching to get closer to the action. That restlessness led him to volunteer for the newly formed No. 11 Scottish Commando, one of Britain's earliest attempts at creating fast-moving elite raiding forces. The training was punishing, with cold water immersions, mountain marches, and hand-to-hand combat drills that left men bloody. But Mayne didn't just survive it, he thrived. The physical challenge matched his strength, and the violence matched his instincts. The commandos were tasked with hitting German-controlled positions along the European coast. Quick raids meant to disrupt, confuse, and damage enemy morale. In March 1941, Mayne took part in Operation Claymore, targeting German oil facilities and fish processing plants in Norway's Lofoten Islands. The raid was successful, equipment was destroyed, German troops captured, and intelligence retrieved. It was Mayne's first real taste of combat. Cold wind tore at their faces, and German bullets ripped across the snow. But he moved with calm aggression, firing precisely, never hesitating. Afterward, though, while the others celebrated, Mayne didn't seem impressed. He hadn't come to play small. He wanted to be deep in enemy territory. He wanted a war that would test everything inside him. Later that year, back in North Africa, he crossed paths with David Sterling, a tall, confident officer with a new idea. Sterling had a vision for a unit that would change how the war was fought. Small groups of ruthless men dropped deep behind enemy lines to cause maximum destruction. No waiting for orders, no standing in line. Just in, strike, and disappear. Sterling was looking for men who could handle complete independence, men who didn't crack under pressure. He was warned that Mayne was uncontrollable, too violent, too unpredictable. But Sterling didn't care. He saw something useful in that unpredictability. Mayne joined Sterling's experimental unit, the Special Air Service, the SAS. At the time, it was little more than a name and an idea. But with Mayne on board, it was about to become something terrifying. He wasn't just another recruit. He became one of its deadliest architects. The North African campaign was brutal, fast-moving, and filled with uncertainty. The vast deserts of Libya and Egypt became the stage for one of World War II's most unpredictable battles. British forces, stretched thin and suffering heavy losses, were constantly outmaneuvered by Erwin Rommel, the German general known for lightning-fast attacks. The usual rules of war didn't work here. What was needed were fighters who could operate in the shadows, far from front lines, fighters like Mayne. Once deployed with the SAS into the desert, Mayne adapted quickly to the terrain. He memorized enemy patrol routes, studied the layout of German airfields, and learned how to move silently through sandstorms and moonlit nights. His raids were always calculated. He would study his target for hours, sometimes days before moving in. He operated with total focus, using the natural silence of the desert to his advantage. His most famous raid took place in December 1941 near Wadi Tamet, where he and a small team infiltrated a heavily guarded airfield. They carried no guns, only knives, grenades, and small packs of explosives. Mayne personally placed charges under aircraft, one by one, with a steady hand and no fear. By the time the sun came up, 24 German planes were in flames, their twisted wreckage littering the sand. Mayne's style was ruthless but efficient. He didn't tolerate hesitation. He expected every man to move like a shadow. If someone panicked or made noise, he'd correct them on the spot, sometimes with a punch, sometimes by cutting them from the mission. He wasn't just eliminating aircraft or supplies. He was breaking the enemy's confidence. German pilots began sleeping with pistols under their pillows, terrified of the silent killers who came with the wind. The desert, once their stronghold, started to feel like a trap. Over time, Mayne developed entirely new techniques for desert warfare. He scrapped large convoys and opted for stripped-down jeeps, fast-moving and lightly armed. He began using diversionary fires to draw enemy troops out before striking the real target. These weren't just battlefield decisions. They became the foundation of how special forces operate, even today. He turned the chaos of the desert into a weapon. By the time 1943 arrived, Paddy Mayne was no longer just one of Sterling's best men. He was the driving force of the SAS. When Sterling was captured by Axis forces in Tunisia, the SAS needed more than just a new leader. They needed someone ruthless, relentless, and fearless. Paddy Mayne stepped in without hesitation. He didn't give speeches. He didn't sit behind maps. He led from the front. Every mission he touched became more brutal, more daring, and more personal. In Sicily, the war had shifted. The landscape was rough. The Germans were desperate, and the SAS had become a scalpel in enemy territory. Mayne's unit slipped through shadows, cut off communication lines, sabotaged enemy convoys, and hit German outposts with lightning speed. On one raid, they knocked out several tanks, destroyed radio posts, and killed nearly 80 soldiers in total silence. The Germans didn't know what hit them. Bodies were found in ditches, gear destroyed, tanks burning in the night, and the British were already gone. But it wasn't just strategy. Mayne's violence was primal. It was said that he once killed a German officer using the man's own helmet. Blunt force trauma, and the man's face caved in. Another enemy soldier was found strangled to death, eyes gouged out with bare hands. There was no evidence, no witness, just silence and whispers. Some said Mayne did it himself. Others said his men had started following his lead, cold, efficient, merciless. He hated cruelty, especially what the Nazis had done to civilians and prisoners. But when it came to German soldiers, he didn't believe in mercy. He wasn't there to take prisoners. He was there to end the fight, fast and violently. During one ambush in mainland Italy, Mayne drove a jeep straight into a German camp alone, one hand on the wheel, the other firing a mounted machine gun. He hurled grenades into tents, strafed bunkers, and kept driving until the entire camp was in flames. By the time reinforcements arrived, the shooting had stopped. The enemy was dead. All of them. Every raid he led left behind a trail of twisted steel and blood-soaked dirt. Mission reports didn't tell the full story. They talked about objectives neutralized and minimal casualties, but the truth was darker. Wherever Mayne went, the battlefield looked more like a massacre. And just when the Germans thought it couldn't get worse, then came the invasion of France. And Mayne was once again leading from the shadows. June 6, 1944, D-Day. While Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy under withering German gunfire, the SAS had already slipped behind enemy lines. Dropped into the dark from low-flying planes, they landed scattered, disoriented, and deep in German territory. No backup, no safety net. Their mission was to destroy everything the enemy needed to fight before it ever reached the battlefield. Mayne hit the dirt hard, but didn't waste a second. His men regrouped fast, moving through the bocage like ghosts. They laid charges on key bridges and railway tracks, bringing entire supply lines to a halt. German trains derailed in showers of sparks and fire. Fuel convoys erupted into black pillars of smoke. Every explosion pushed the German front line closer to chaos. At one point, Mayne's unit intercepted a column of armored vehicles moving under cover of night. They mined the road hours before. When the lead truck exploded, it triggered a chain reaction that sent tanks tumbling sideways into ditches. The survivors tried to escape, some on fire, some screaming in panic. Mayne walked among the wreckage and shot each one. There was no shouting, no mercy, just the sharp rhythm of a gun doing its job. In the countryside near Caen, intelligence pointed to a German communication hub disguised as a farmhouse. The SAS crept in under the cover of early morning fog. Mayne led the assault himself, bursting through the front with his Thompson raised. Inside, it was brutal. One soldier was beaten to death with the butt of a rifle. Another had his head slammed into a desk until the wood cracked. The rest never even got a chance to scream. Once the building was cleared, Mayne rigged it with explosives. Minutes later, it was nothing but shattered timber and smoke curling into the gray sky. But the most ruthless moment came in a village just outside Saint-Lô. A German detachment had seized control of the town hall and turned it into a local command post. Civilians were being used as human shields, some tortured for information, others executed for defiance. Locals begged for help. Mayne didn't hesitate. Under the cover of night, his team surrounded the building. They sealed the doors. Then, without a word, they lit the structure from the ground up. Screams echoed through the streets as the fire caught. Some soldiers tried to leap through the windows to escape. They didn't get far. Mayne picked them off in the open, methodical and unmoved. In the days that followed, a captured German officer told Allied interrogators that Mayne looked like he was born for war. He moved through burning wreckage like it was nothing, like the fire didn't even touch him. His boots had been scorched red by the heat. But behind the killing, behind the discipline, something darker was growing. Mayne had always carried ghosts from North Africa, but in Normandy, they multiplied. The hedgerows weren't just soaked in blood, they reeked of rot. Dead were left hanging from trees, stuffed in cellars, or buried alive beneath rubble. Whole villages were reduced to ash, and the screams didn't stop when the shooting did. And yet, Mayne never stopped moving. He didn't ask for breaks. He didn't speak about what he saw. But his men noticed the changes, including long silences, heavier drinking, and sudden flashes of rage. He started waking in the middle of the night, grabbing for his sidearm, heart pounding. But the next morning, he was back in uniform, eyes sharp, rifle loaded. The war hadn't broken him. Not yet, but it was coming close. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. Cities were burning. The Wehrmacht was in retreat. But for Mayne, the mission didn't change. Kill the enemy, dismantle what was left, and leave nothing behind. The SAS moved fast through shattered towns and frozen forests, targeting supply lines, munitions depots, and fleeing remnants of the SS. In April, they stormed a heavily guarded barracks near Ruhr. Intelligence had marked it as a regrouping point for high-ranking officers. Mayne led the assault at dawn. The firefight lasted less than a half an hour. When it was over 100 German soldiers were dead, most killed before they could even fire back. Bullet holes covered the walls. Grenade shrapnel shredded uniforms. Mayne moved through the wreckage, checking bodies, making sure none got back up. In the basement, he found the unit's commanding officer cowering behind barrels. According to one of his men, Mayne didn't speak. He dragged the officer into the light and beat him with the butt of his Lee Enfield until the man's skull caved in. No hesitation, no pause, just raw justice, delivered in seconds. In one case, they intercepted a fleeing SS convoy. Instead of engaging at range, Mayne ordered a full-speed ambush. Trucks flipped, tires exploded, and survivors were shot as they tried to crawl away. No one escaped. Identification papers were torched, weapons were piled and set ablaze. Every trace of the convoy vanished. Across Germany, his signature was the same: speed, brutality, silence. Factories were wired with explosives and reduced to rubble. Airfields were raided and stripped of anything useful before being destroyed. Mayne personally oversaw the demolition of aircraft hangars packed with fuel and ammunition. The resulting explosions could be seen from miles away. By war's end, he had taken out over 130 enemy planes, one on the ground, some in mid-operation. May 1945, the war was finally over. Nazi Germany surrendered, but Mayne didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He walked away from the front lines with over 30 confirmed missions, dozens of ambushes, hundreds of confirmed kills, and a reputation that made even his own men nervous. But victories come with a cost. Years of blood and fire had stripped something out of him. He didn't talk about what he'd seen. He didn't have to. It was all there, written in his silence, in the way he looked through people instead of at them. For him, the war had ended, but the battlefield silence didn't bring him peace. It only made the noise inside louder. Mayne returned to Northern Ireland with medals on his chest and ghosts in his head. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order 3 times, an almost unheard of honor. His men saw him as a war god, but in civilian life, that meant nothing. He struggled to adjust. He tried to rejoin society, but it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Law had once been his path, but now courtrooms and paperwork felt meaningless. He drifted, tried business, that failed too. Alcohol became his routine. Fights became his language. He'd lash out in pubs for no reason, knocking men unconscious like they were enemy soldiers. And when he wasn't violent, he was silent. People close to him said he'd sit for hours in one spot, lost in thought, eyes locked on something no one else could see. His lips would move sometimes, whispering names of friends buried in foreign soil. The nightmares never stopped. Every night was a battlefield. Screams, explosions, fire. He couldn't escape it, not even in his sleep. Some mornings he woke up drenched in sweat, his hands clenched, nails dug into his palms. And yet nobody around him knew how to help. PTSD wasn't something people understood. It was just called shell shock, and you were expected to get over it. He isolated himself. He stopped talking to most people. On December 14th, 1955, he died after crashing his car into a lamppost in the early hours of the morning. He was alone. There were no skid marks on the road, no sign he tried to break. Officially, it was ruled an accident, but to those who knew him best, it looked more like a man finally giving in. A man who had seen too much and carried too many ghosts. He was only 40 years old, and in a way, the war never really ended for him.